Arnold's garage proves some trucks stay off limits. AM General built 11,818 Hummer H1s from 1992 to 2006, and he bought the first civilian one. Today, I'll show you the 7 Arnold trucks you'd never be allowed to own for real. 7. Pinzgauer 6x6. A 6-wheeler built for Alpine armies, not normal errands. Arnold has one that makes steep terrain look easy. This Pinzgauer 6x6 came out of Graz, Austria in the early 1970s, and it was built for military mobility, full stop. That matters because the whole design starts with one idea: get through anything, and comfort comes way later. The 712 Series 6x6 sits close to 5 meters long, carries up to 14 people, and uses a 2.5-liter air-cooled 4-cylinder making around 65 kilowatts of power, linked to a 5-speed manual and 2-speed transfer case. Does that engine sound small for a big truck, and also kind of perfect for real terrain? Here is the real reason people respect it. The chassis uses a central tube frame with portal axles, independent suspension, and locking differentials across all 3 axles, and suddenly the power number stops being the headline. The specs get serious fast, with 100% grades, about 700 millimeters water, and over 330 millimeters clearance even when it is loaded. When you hear those numbers, you can almost picture it crawling where normal trucks just spin. Would you even know what to do with a vehicle that can climb like that? Military coverage even called it one of the most capable all-terrain vehicles ever made. And that line hits harder when you see the context. More troop capacity than a Humvee, plus towing up to 5,000 kilograms on road. Production of the first generation ran from 1971 to 1985 in Austria, and later Pinzgauer 2 models came from the UK into the late 2000s, which is how surplus examples ended up with private owners as expedition rigs. So why would you never own Arnold's version? The pool is tiny, export and inspection rules vary by country, and keeping a specialty drivetrain healthy costs time and money. Add Austrian home pride plus his name attached, and the price jumps into a different world. Keep that military energy because the next truck flips fuel completely. If you are into this kind of hidden garage stuff, give this video some hype right now. Hit subscribe and drop a like so YouTube pushes it to more truck fans. Stay with me because the next truck gets even harder to legally own. 6. Hydrogen H2H Hummer. A Hummer that breathes out water vapor sounds unreal. In 2004, Arnold used one to sell a big idea. General Motors built the H2H prototype in 2004 based on the Hummer H2 SUT, then handed it to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger as a public test bed. The clever part is what they did under the hood, because GM kept the 6.0-liter Vortec V8, then re-engineered it to run on gaseous hydrogen. That choice aimed for one clean headline. The main tailpipe emission becomes water vapor. If you are thinking, okay, what is the downside? You're asking the right question. The downside was range. Reports put it around 60 miles per tank, which meant it could not do long drives, but it could do short, high-visibility demos around Los Angeles. That limitation mattered because Arnold tied the truck to his California Hydrogen Highway Network, launched by Executive Order S0704 in April 2004. The order called for 150 to 200 stations by 2010 along major corridors, and the H2H acted like a rolling billboard for that goal. How do you convince people to switch fuels when the refueling network barely exists? At an early event near LAX, he told reporters, "This is a modest beginning, but hydrogen cars hold the promise of a revolution." GM's own messaging went even harder, with Arnold saying, "The H2H is a bold experiment. The H2H shows that a vehicle of today can run on the fuel of tomorrow." Those quotes matter because the truck never headed to showrooms. It stayed a one-off demonstration vehicle under tight control. The twist is what happened to the bigger plan. California kept experimenting with hydrogen, but that original 2010 station target fell far short. landing at dozens rather than hundreds. That gap turns the H2H into a rare artifact of ambition, not something a regular buyer can copy. Now watch the Hummer idea go quiet and a lot stranger. 5. All-electric Hummer H1 prototype. Take the Hummer everyone expects and remove the exhaust. In 2017, Arnold stood there and made that real. Kreisel Electric, an Austrian startup, unveiled an all-electric Hummer H1 prototype in 2017 with Schwarzenegger on stage at their R&D center in Rheinbach, Upper Austria. The diesel drivetrain was removed and a 100 kilowatt-hour battery went in, feeding dual electric motors, one on each axle, for a combined 360 kilowatt output, or about 490 PS. If you know the H1's reputation, that swap feels like a direct challenge, because the truck still looks tough, but the story changes instantly. Even with a curb weight around 3.3 tons, the conversion reportedly reaches 120 kilometers per hour and delivers an estimated 300 kilometer range on a charge. That is where the comparison becomes unavoidable. A standard H1 can burn up to 24 liters per 100 kilometers and emit roughly 470 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer. So this prototype cuts tailpipe emissions to zero while keeping that big square stance. Does that make it practical, or does it just make it a different kind of extreme? Arnold leaned into the moment with a joke that also sounded like a challenge. He said, "Kreisel Electric electrified my G-Class last winter, and now a Hummer. If Kreisel keeps it up at this pace, I will soon be able to fly here from LA in an electric airplane." That quote matters because it shows how public this build was meant to be. Kreisel also said the H1 took just 2 months to design and build, which explains why it stayed a one-off prototype built for testing and publicity, not a production run. You cannot order it, you cannot replicate the battery pack or software without Kreisel's cooperation, and you definitely cannot buy the exact truck tied to that unveiling. The quiet twist is that the H1 shape stays familiar, but the sound people expect disappears completely. Next, the same H1 silhouette gets rarer, and it looks more guarded. 4. Slantback Hummer H1. You know the H1 looks like a rolling block of metal. Angle the rear roof, and it suddenly feels military again. Among Schwarzenegger's H1s, the slantback stands out because it echoes the Humvee body style used by the US military. Collector explanations point out that beyond the regular wagon and soft top, less known variants included a 2-door pickup and a 4-door slantback that shares the same basic shape as the Humvee. That one change flips the vibe because it looks less like a celebrity truck and more like something built for deployment. So how rare is it really? One documented 2000 H1 slantback listing calls it one of only 39 produced for that model year, and that tiny number is why people chase it. Power came from a 6.5-liter turbo diesel V8 with full-time 4x4, inboard disc brakes, and dual fuel tanks. And that setup keeps the H1 character intact. Add 37-inch tires and a curb weight sitting well over 3.5 tons, and it starts feeling closer to a street-legal carrier than an SUV. Would you even want to park a truck shaped like that in a normal garage? Coverage of Arnold's collection regularly mentions a Hummer H1 slantback alongside his standard H1 and other military-inspired vehicles. That pairing matters because the slantback leans into the frontline look, yet it still gets the comfort touches you expect in a celebrity vehicle, like leather and climate control. That contrast is the hook. Military shape, street comfort, one body. The detail people miss is how fame multiplies rarity. You might find a slantback somewhere, but a Schwarzenegger-linked example sits in a different category where price and paperwork rise together. Next, you need to hear how the Hummer story started, with Arnold pushing hard. 3. Original civilian Hummer H1. Imagine seeing military Humvees and wanting one for yourself. Arnold pushed AM General until a civilian version happened. During the early 1990s, Schwarzenegger saw Humvees on set and pressed AM General for a street-legal version. Coverage around the launch notes that when civilian production began in 1992, the first vehicle was bought by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had lobbied AM General for a civilian model. That quote is huge because it frames the H1 as a truck that started with one person refusing to let the idea die. How often do you see a personal request turn into a whole new product? The civilian H1 kept the military bones and stayed extreme in size. It measures around 4.69 meters long and about 2.20 meters wide, and diesel versions weigh over 3,100 kilograms. Ground clearance hits 16 inches and approach angles can reach 72 degrees, which explains the unstoppable look even when it's parked. Then reality shows up, because owners report fuel economy around 10 to 12 miles per gallon, and that number lands differently when you picture daily traffic in tight parking lots. Would you enjoy owning something that big if every trip feels like a small mission? In the early 2000s, the Hummer turned into a cultural symbol, and Vox later called the line a symbol of early 2000s excess and militarist aesthetic obsession. Arnold became tied to that image, often arriving at premieres in a Hummer instead of a limo, and that visibility made the truck feel larger than life. Production stayed niche at 11,818 H1s from 92 to 2006, and tightening US diesel emissions rules helped end the run. So why would you never be allowed to own the one he drives? Early H1s with direct Schwarzenegger ties sit where collector value, rarity, and emissions and registration rules collide. Next, the collection jumps backward into a real war truck you can touch. 2. Dodge M37. Picture driving a Korean War cargo truck in modern traffic. Arnold keeps one like it belongs in daily life. Schwarzenegger owns a military-spec Dodge M37, the 3/4-ton 4x4 cargo truck that entered U.S. service in 1951 as the successor to Dodge's World War II WC series. Dodge built around 115,000 M37s between 1951 and 1968, and these trucks hauled troops and equipment through the Korean and Vietnam Wars before the military moved on. That timeline matters because it shows a vehicle that stayed useful for years under hard conditions. So what makes it feel so different from anything modern? It runs a 230 cubic inch T245 flathead straight 6, making about 78 horsepower, and top speed sits near 55 miles per hour on good roads. That sounds slow until you remember it weighs more than 5,900 pounds empty, rides on live axles with leaf springs, and has a low-range transfer case meant for mud, river crossings, and rough trails. The design goal was survival, not comfort, which is why modern features never enter the conversation. Would you trust yourself driving something that heavy when modern cars expect quick braking and fast merging? The Estrella Warbird Museum calls the M37 one of the most successful military vehicles in U.S. history because it fixed issues in earlier Dodge military trucks and stayed useful for decades. After service, many M37s went to forestry services and rural fire departments, then into private hands. Collector coverage describes Arnold's truck as a military-spec Dodge M37 restored to its former glory, and that wording signals a serious restoration path rather than a quick paint job. Here is the twist. You can buy an M37, but Arnold's version stacks a documented military chassis, a pricey frame-off restoration, and celebrity provenance that changes the value conversation completely. Next, the biggest truck in this list turns into a one-off monster build. 1. Mercedes Unimog U1300 SE. You think a big truck means a lifted pickup. Arnold parked something beside a Hummer H1 that looked small. This began as a 1977 Mercedes Unimog U1300 SE, a medium-duty workhorse Mercedes built for farms, armies, and fire brigades. In 2012, Schwarzenegger bought one and sent it back to Germany, where Merrick's Mehrtech stripped it and rebuilt it to his personal spec in Gaggenau. That move matters because it turns an old utility truck into a custom piece with a real paper trail. What did they change first, and why does it look so serious? They swapped the original 5.7-liter engine for a 6.4-liter turbo diesel inline-six pushing around 320 PS connected to a manual gearbox. The stance got even more extreme with 22-inch wheels and Michelin XZL 445/65 tires, which you normally see on military support trucks. Inside, the whole vibe flips. Black leather, a Blaupunkt audio system, and a reversing camera, which feels almost funny when you remember this thing started as a working tool. Why build luxury into something that looks ready for disaster relief? Auction catalogs describe it in one clean line. Custom built for Arnold Schwarzenegger, a one-of-a-kind 1977 Mercedes Unimog U1300 SE. That one-of-a-kind part matters because Merrick's Mertec turned the suspension with air springs, added a heavy roll bar, a winch, hella auxiliary lights, and a custom flatbed with bench seating. Basically a civilian troop truck built for one very specific lifestyle. In early 2024, the same Unimog sold at Barrett Jackson in Scottsdale for about $4.16 million, roughly $220,000, showing only around 2,700 miles and carrying his signature on the dashboard. You can buy a Unimog, but you cannot order this exact spec in Providence from any dealer. That is the wild part. These trucks exist, but they stay behind money, rules, and connections. If one surprised you, drop it below and tap the next video now.